that I am a racing champion. But the day has finally come, and this is our celebration. All right.
Happy New Year's!
Yeah, Happy New Year!
Happy New Year!
Woo! Woo!
Happy New Year!
Oh! Oh! Oh!
Go.
1,
You ready?
2.
I mean, hang on. We don't know when it's gonna pop.
Face this way a little more.
I mean, it's gonna fly
Like
off.
that.
It's gonna fly off.
Oh,
3. And happy.
I mean, I think I gotta push pretty hard. So
Push.
take off your shirt.
Push like you're having a baby.
I always watch the movies.
man.
You gotta shake it before you pop.
It
You gotta
said
get
not.
some
It
carbon
said not
behind
to
it.
shake it.
Well, how are you gonna pop it elsewise?
I don't know.
Now it's just gonna flop off.
Corkscrew,
It's
buddy.
coming out. It's coming
It's not
out.
gonna pop.
Get it, get it.
Hey, it's almost out there. Okay, it's almost up.
That's what I say in the bathroom.
Nipply. Do it, Evan.
It's getting
Do it.
nipply.
That's what I said.
You said a bit nipply. I think it's breast. There we go.
Yeah,
Inside.
lower.
Huh?
Come on, Evan. Use them.
Go on!
Pop.
Give him a slap in the butt.
Oh,
This is ridiculous. Hey, you guys should give this a try. Believe me.
Come on. Come on, boy.
It ain't me.
Get it. Get it. Get it.
Oh,
Crap!
oh man.
We didn't get it.
Well, it's open.
Yeah,
We're gonna go
we
drink it.
got it. Hooray for New Year's.
That killed my thumbs, man. That was really hard to
Yeah.
get off. It's not as easy as it looks.
Oh man, New Year's, New Year's.
Believe me, that was not nearly as
Well,
easy as
we went out to the store. We bought some pie and ice cream. Blueberry pie
Yum.
It's so
and ice cream.
Yeah.
Pretty lady in
Hello.
here.
I made your pies over there.
You did? You made my pie?
Our pie's
Just
right
got
there.
some ice cream?
Huh?
Okay, well I'm gonna eat some pie and ice cream.
Jeanette, come in, listen.
To what? Okay, I
We're
will.
recording.
Alright, cool.
Bye. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year!
Happy New Year!
My name is James. This is
James Cameron Massey.
I will be doing a documentary on his life and I'll be asking him some questions. First thing I want to ask you is when and where you were born, and tell us a bit about your childhood.
I was born on November 6, 1919. I was the second child born into my family. My father was Fred William Massey, and my mother was Mary Emily Cameron Massey. My grandfather was Joseph Cameron, and his wife was Cora May Hill on my mother's side. And on my father's side, grandfather was George William Massey, and my grandmother was Ann Call. She was the daughter of Dan Call from Lynchburg, Virginia. I'm sorry, that was not Lynchburg, Virginia, but Lynchburg, Tennessee. We lived in a little village in Lincoln County, Tennessee, named Flintville. We were living there for the first seven and a half or 8 years of my life. And I had a sister who was 2 years older than I. Dorothy Mae Utley. And my brother was born 5 years after me, and he is Joseph or Joe Louis Massey. He lives in San Antonio, and my sister lives at Lakewood Manor in Richmond. We had what I think these days you might call a somewhat idyllic kind of childhood. We had a good house. We had a very large yard, and we were comfortable in our community. We lived near a railroad track that came between Nashville and Chattanooga, Tennessee. It was always fun waving at the engineers and the conductors and sometimes the passengers on the train. We played outside a great deal of the time when the weather permitted. It was always a great time when my mother's brothers and their family came to visit. We had one uncle and aunt who lived in the adjoining lot, and they had 4 children. So all of us together from time to time would put on programs that might include some reading of poetry or some fun things. We would do all kinds of little dramatic things using the large window seat under some windows as our stage. In the summers, we sometimes played church. Church was a big part of our life. We always attended. As a matter of fact, my great-grandfather Cameron was one of the founders of the the Baptist Church at Flintville, and his portrait is in the vestibule of that small church. That was near the schoolhouse, and it was so that if a child got unruly in church, his parents could take him outside to the schoolhouse and teach him why. I made a confession of faith in Christ when I was 7 years of age, and was baptized in a small stream known as Blue Hole. And I've had the privilege in recent years of visiting that site, and it's still there. We had a father who traveled a good bit. He worked for a company known as Tennessee Products Corporation, that and his role was going through the woods, tramping through woods and marking trees for the benefit of the company. Later they would come and cut the trees and haul them out. But his role was selection of the trees to be cut. Later, he became involved in the insurance business and worked for the Home Beneficial Life Insurance Company, big part of his life. My mother was somewhat of a perfectionist about housekeeping. There's a joke in the family about my being light-skinned and small, and they said that my mama washed me so much that I just faded away. She was always careful that I didn't get sunburned too much. And some of my cousins still laugh about the fact that occasionally when July and August days came along and the sun was very hot and there was a lot of humidity, that they saw me going down the yard through the little village toward the school with my sister, and I had to stay under a little umbrella that we carried to shield us from the sun. We lived in Winchester, Tennessee, when I was about 8 or 9.
What year do you think that was?
It was about 26 or 7. I remember the presidential election, the year that Al Smith ran, and one of the big questions that at that time was that he was a Catholic, and Baptists were very suspicious that a Catholic president might do us harm. We were active in the community. My grandfather, who died before I was born, actually, my grandfather Cameron died early. But he was a merchant and had 2 stores. He had one in Fayetteville, which was the county seat for Lincoln County. And he had another store in Flintville, which was not far from our house. We had good friends, and it was always fun when my mother's brothers came from Nashville and other points for family outings. And we would run around, and our uncles would wrestle with us and spill coins out of their pockets and things like that, that children love. We had a deep well, and we drew water from the well with a windlass. We had a small building that was adjacent to the well, where we had a sawdust pit, and we would buy large chunks of ice, like 100 pounds at a time, and put it in the sawdust pit, and it would that would help preserve it and keep things cool. We also had a woodshed, and every once in a while we had to carry wood from the woodshed to the kitchen, because the range in the kitchen was an iron stove that was fueled by wood. We lived in Winchester for 3 or 4 years, and then we went to Columbia, Tennessee, when my father had lost his job during the Depression, and we were buying a house in Winchester, which was lost when we couldn't, cover the mortgage. But we went to Columbia to work for the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, better known now as MetLife. And then later my dad switched to the home beneficial company. We lived in Columbia during the time that I was in puberty, and went to about the 8th grade at the school in Winchester, in Columbia. We lived in a pleasant apartment in a large old house that was a duplex, and we had Episcopalian neighbors in the next apartment, and the lady was a vocalist and had a beautiful piano, and so we heard music right often. I remember sitting by the radio during that time, and we listened to Amos and Andy, which is a comic classic in those days. And we had a fine church in Columbia. We were very active there. I began being a royal ambassador there, and Miss Alma Reed was my leader. She was a maiden lady, a school teacher, and she had a real heart for missions and for boys. And there I began working on the various ranks that RAs do. When we left Columbia, we moved to Nashville, and we lived in several places. I recall we lived in 3 different places in Nashville, in East Nashville, on Fall Street and North 16th Street, and at 405 Scott Avenue. We had a streetcar that came into East Nashville, and my first year of high school was punctuated with riding the streetcar from our section of the city to East Nashville High School. That was a wonderful school, large metropolitan school, and I studied Latin there. I took 3.5 years of Latin in high school. I was basically an English major there. One of my favorite teachers of all time was the English teacher there, Miss Catherine Atkinson. And she always expected the best. Whatever it was, she asked you to do. And I remember one time she asked me to do a project that demonstrated the beginning of drama and theater. And theater began in church graveyards. And we had multi-dimensional projects that built things like the Globe Theater and ancient churches and things like that. Anyway, the only math I have had in my life I learned at East High. Somehow I managed to get through college without taking any kind of math. But I did have geometry in high school. Another important event, I think, at high school was that I was introduced to a new subject called sociology, and the school offered that for the first time. It was in that class that I learned about counseling. I learned about education for mental health. I learned about marriage and family, and as a matter of fact, I recall writing an essay which had to do with marriage and some of the more intimate aspects of a marriage. And the teacher was highly impressed with that paper and insisted that although he never mentioned my name, had another student read it to the class. And so my interest in psychiatry and psychoanalysis and clinical psychology and all of those health disciplines was defined and learned in that particular class. So I graduated from East High in 1938. Meantime, all during that time, I was active in the Eastland Baptist Church. I continued with the Royal Ambassador program, became a counselor for RAs, and eventually received the degree they called Ambassador Plenipotentiary, and ultimately the rank of counselor. Because of that, I had the privilege of being invited to speak briefly at the WMU convention that was held in Chattanooga, and several of our troop went to Chattanooga for that convention. We went to retreats as well in the old women's college at Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And the church meant a lot to me. I was occasionally teaching a class of small children, and I went from that kind of life. I had a girlfriend, and I don't know what in the world we did. There were no TVs. There were no big radios. We sat on either end of the couch and chatted about school and about church, and that's about it. But we were good friends and not lovers. I served as Vacation Bible School director for Eastland Church several times, and that was during the time that I was a student at Carson Newman College, where I began my college education in 1938 in the fall. I was lucky enough to get an NYA, which is National Youth Administration program assistance, so that I could work while I was going to college. And while I was at Carson Newman, I worked in the alumni office. I did a lot of multigraph and various kinds of printing of stationery and all kinds of paper products. And at Carson Newman, I majored in English again.
When you say that back then, did you have to declare a major at your high school? Because earlier you mentioned that you were an English major at your high school.
That's the way I have always thought of it. I don't recall specifically that it was required that you name a major, but we had a system where you signed up for your colleges, for your classes individually, and more like a college. And I always chose the English because I did best in English or in Latin, and enjoyed languages, and that was a fortunate high school experience. We had to walk sometimes, quite a few blocks. Never did walk over the mountains and around the trails, but on city streets. And part of the way on the streetcar. I had my tonsils out in a doctor's office at the age of 15, and that's the only surgery that I've had to have since then, except for cataract surgery on both eyes. And that's right remarkable these days, for which I'm thankful. At Carson Newman, I had a very pleasant and good experience because I was a part of the Philomathian Literary Society, and served as the president of that group 1 quarter during my senior year. But the highlight of the second year was that I was settling myself spiritually and mentally with regard to religion. I had never really had a lot of questions about science and religion. I began to think and look more deeply at all those questions that you tend to face. And it was a painful year in some regards, because I had been so active even in the minor leadership roles that I had been in a religious setting. That was an important time for me because I was a member of the volunteer band, which was a group that felt a call or a possible call to be missionaries. And I had a strong interest in that. I felt, however, that my work would be as a professor in a college or some educational institution on the foreign field. I had a special interest in Africa. And during the time that I was at Carson Newman, I was active somewhat with the black high school that was in the town. And for about a year, school year, I was the one who designed the chapel that was held in that school for at least once a week or once a month, something, I forget exactly. But it was a good experience, and I did not think about being a minister at that point. As a matter of fact, being a pastor sounded like the most dull thing in the world at that juncture. And but I had good friends in that group of volunteers with whom I could bare my soul and say anything and still be accepted. One of those was a girl named Gladys Hopewell. She was a year or two ahead of me in school, but we had conversations many times about deep things, and she had a very level head and was helpful in that struggle. But finally, by the way, Gladys Hopewell was later a missionary to China and was murdered in her apartment during her service there. But my doubts and fears and anxieties all came to a sort of climax during that time, because I could give myself the answers that I thought I would get from a pastor, and I didn't feel comfortable going to my pastor because I thought I knew what would be said. I realize now that I was unfair about that. But I chose one Wednesday night to do something about that. I was at a regular prayer service at our church at Jefferson City, Tennessee, and among the persons there was Dr. Carl Tab Bonner. And Dr. Bonner was a chemistry professor. He was my chemistry professor. And I knew that if I could talk with him, it might help. I felt kind of like a hypocrite singing the hymns because I didn't feel that way. And I asked Dr. Bonner after the service if I could go home with him or ask him some questions. And he said, why, of course. And we walked down to his house, and he built a fire in the fireplace and pulled up a chair. And
Sorry to interrupt real quick. When you say you were having questions, would you say you were having questions regarding your faith? Whether you were questioning science over religion? What were the sort of things that you were needing to go to him for?
well, I think it was the need to, as Walter Rauschenbusch once said, get my own faith. Because I needed to get to a point where I was comfortable that I had made that choice and that I understood it in as far as you can understand, and that I knew how to live with my doubts and not be scared of them. And Dr. Bonner helped me see that. In the first place, he was so relaxed, and when I got to his house, I emptied my soul. I just knew I had to let it all out. And he sat there and listened till I was finished. And then he had a little wry smile on his face, and he said, "You are so, so fortunate." He said, "This didn't happen to me until I was in seminary." Well, he began to ask me some questions. He said, how much are you sleeping these days? He said, are you eating regularly? And he asked me how my classes were going. And I told him that English Lit was hard. And I was staying up late, pushing myself to be ready for class the next day, because to me, to be asked a question I couldn't answer was an embarrassment. But he said, you know, he said, sometimes it would be better if you threw the English Lit book over in the corner and went to bed. Well, that conversation made me feel like I was walking on springs. He said, don't worry about doubting. There are many things that are mysteries. And he helped me to see that we are human. We're not God. can't explain all of the things that are mysterious. But we need to have faith. And to ask a question that you're thinking about is a healthy kind of doubt. The kind of doubt that refuses to believe, that turns one's back and will not struggle with the questions. That's negative doubt. Well, it was a great highlight of my life when I went back to school in 1940.
You went back to school?
After the summer recess.
Oh.
Went back to Carson Newman 1940. And the reason it was such a highlight is that there was a new group of girls. And one of those was the girl that I ultimately fell in love with and decided to be my wife. And if she would have me, I would have her. Well, I had some interesting experiences along that line. We met when she arrived. She is from Georgia, and when she came to Jefferson City, she got off the train, came up to the college, and was in front of Sarah Swan dormitory, and was getting baggage into the house and that sort of thing. And I helped her and some friends she was with a little bit with the baggage. I don't remember the baggage, I remember the girls. But not long after that, I asked her for a date for a formal dinner. Carson Newman had the notion that everybody needed to learn the niceties of society. And so they had formal dinners at, how often? At least once a month, if not more. When all the girls wore their finery and long dresses, and the fellows dressed up the best they could, and wore tie, and as it happened that year, I was host at the end of a long table that seated about 14 people, and poured the milk and the water for everybody as the glasses came around. And I don't remember who was at the other end of the table, but about the second or third seat on my left was Frankie Massey, now Frankie Massey. We became friends. I asked her for the formal dinner, and we had a good year. I don't remember which year it was. We soon became prayer mates in BSU, and we have been ever since. We don't remember all the dates, but we had some very interesting outings and things of that nature. I used to sit with her on the bank of Mossy Creek. Our lady dormitory police lady was very strict about being too close to one another, or you didn't see people making out anywhere around on the campus or in the Saraswan parlors. But we had to go on Sunday afternoon sometimes for a walk, and there was a creek not too far from the campus called Mossy Creek. We went to Mossy Creek and we sat on the bank, and I read poetry to Frankie, and that was a sweet time. Very precious time. We loved Browning's Come Grow along with me. The best is yet to be, the last of life for which the first was made. And we have that on our sundial in the patio. So let's see, what else?
Well, let's take a break real quick,
Okay.
and we will come back in just a few minutes.
Okay.
All right.
One evening, about dusk, I was walking down the sidewalk, very wide sidewalk, in front of the administration building at Carson Newman, and all of a sudden there was a fantastic display of color in various deep shades of red and orange, and it was absolutely stunning, but frightening as well. And I had heard these preachers with their vivid accounts of the second coming, and it looked almost like that was about to happen. I've never seen anything quite like it before or since. But it turned out to be Northern Lights,
Oh, wow.
and it was very remarkable. We had some drama at Carson Newman. And I remember being in one dramatic club production, and I was the English butler, using my version of English accent and dialogue. I graduated from Carson Newman in 1942. I remember late in 1941 that I was in my room in Blank Davis Hall when the radio announcement about Pearl Harbor occurred. And that was a frightening word, because the world was at war. And my father contacted the draft board. The draft was instituted almost immediately to call people up for military service. And my father went to the draft board in Nashville and said that I was in my senior year, and requested that they postpone my service until that time, and then I graduated. As it happened, on the day that I got my degree, which was a Bachelor of Arts, cum laude, the greetings from Uncle Sam arrived the same day. Shortly after that, I was called up for service and was inducted. I went to the old train station in Nashville with my family and got on the train to go to Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, for induction. I suppose because I was perhaps the only sober college graduate in the train, they gave me the roster and made me be responsible for keeping the roster and keeping the right number of people together until we got to Fort Oglethorpe. So on July the 4th, 1942, I was sworn in as an Army private and sent to Camp Forest, Tennessee, at Tullahoma, Tennessee. I was at Tullahoma for almost 2 years in basic training. somewhere along the way became a corporal, and but they eventually, since I was one that didn't cuss and went to the services, I was appointed to be the chaplain's assistant at Camp Forest. That is for our particular battery. I was assigned to the field artillery, and the basic training in that was, I think, quite good. After a while, though, I felt that I should be or could be an officer. And the opportunity came up to apply. I did apply and went through the process and eventually was accepted to learn how to be an officer in the field artillery. Well, during that time, the war was extremely hot. First and second lieutenants were being killed so that they had a dire need for second lieutenants. And the only, the general in our division would not endorse officer candidate school for anybody except for artillery second lieutenants. Anyway, I decided to go on with that. I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for training. That would be about 12 weeks or thereabouts. I made it fine through the first part of the program in a class of 600. The discipline was monstrously strict. The worst bawling out I ever had was because I was walking across the parade ground to the mess hall about 5:30 in the morning on a very cold, windy morning, and I had my hands in my pockets. And that was not permitted. And so I really got reamed out for that. When it came to firing howitzers, however, the fact that I had not any math in college was really showing up because you have to fire angles where you have batteries, howitzers over in one field, and you are in the top of a church steeple somewhere, and your target is way off in another direction. And you have to figure the angles, and you have to take into account the wind and everything that affects the trajectory of a shell. Well, the first time I had ever seen a howitzer fire, I was supposed to be the captain or battery commander.
We'll take a short break for the phone call.
The experience at Fort Sill was upsetting in that I failed to make that goal of becoming an officer. I realized while I was trying to fire that howitzer, which I could do when it was at regular range and the target was visible. But when it got to what they call angle T's, I couldn't do the math fast enough to make it work. So I flunked. That was hard because I had never failed a grade. I had never failed a class. My lowest grade in college was a C+. That was in chemistry. And that was kind of a bitter pill. It was embarrassing. But I found out that of the class of 600, 60% were flunked. And so I felt a little better at that point. But I was embarrassed for my wife because we were newly married at the time, and I was facing reassignment and a lot of uncertainty. As it turned out, I was sent back to Camp Forest and with a different part of the 80th Infantry Division. And I worked with the chaplains. During that time, I worked basically for 4 different denominations. 2 chaplains were Episcopalian, 1 was Disciples of Christ, and 1 was Baptist. They were all honorable men. They were all people I could respect and appreciate. That was a valuable part of my experience generally in education for what I would do later in life. In 1944, I was part of an advance party for the 80th Division that went to England, and we were on a ship, large ship that corkscrewed its way across the Atlantic Ocean, and we were quartered in the northern part of England. one of the interesting memories I have of that experience is that I was pressed into an unaccustomed role when I was told I had to drive a 6x6 truck with ammunition boxes from northern England all the way to Southampton. And of course, you know, England drives on the left side of the road. And when you drive a 6x6 Army truck, you've got to double clutch. So I had never done that before. And I did know how to drive, of course, but that was a kind of scary experience, driving in a convoy of I don't know how many vehicles, large number of vehicles. But anyway, that trip down and back was accomplished without any undue troubles. After about 6 weeks, we went over to France, crossing the English Channel at night, and getting to the beach in time to go out on in daylight. And I had a chaplain's jeep to be responsible for, and I drove the jeep out of the ship onto the sands, and at that time the front lines were about 20 miles away. You could hear the sounds of howitzers, and we had to go immediately to an orchard and try to dig ourselves in with foxholes, and we found rock hard ground that there's no way you could dig a foxhole there. Anyway, I was a part of the headquarters battery at that time, and a part of the special troops group of the headquarters battery of the 80th Infantry. And we were part of the Third Army, of which General Patton was the general. I was in all of those movements back and forth across France and Germany. I remember many of those places, although the sequence in time fades from memory. But one thing I do remember specifically is that we were one night in a French forest where it had been raining all day long. We tried to make a bivouac. The mud was up on the wheels of the vehicles. You could hardly walk without marring up in the mud. But we had a little pup tent pitched. The chaplain and I were going to sleep in. And I crawled into that pup tent, and it's the kind that if you roll over and touch it, you've got a new rain hole, because the water would seep through. And the howitzers in the next field were thundering constantly. Rain was pouring down. It was pretty miserable. I'm a new husband, away from home, in a strange land, and kind of miserable. And I said to myself, I wonder what all this means. Am I really here? And that led to a question, does God know? Does God care? And there came to mind this old hymn that I remember from the days when I was before 7, in the little country church in Flintville. Does Jesus care? Oh yes, he cares. His heart is touched by my grief. And then you get to a chorus that is an expression of faith. And I relaxed and rolled over and went to sleep, knowing that the German 88s would be coming in if they could get a fix on those howitzers in the next field. There were many experiences that go along with war. I had to carry a carbine. I never had to fire it except in training. But I remember times, for example, riding shotgun with a machine gun, racing at breakneck speed down a German road, not knowing where ambushes might be. I've seen people lying in the ditches dead, with maggots crawling all over their bodies, and bodies where tanks were burned. I remember a time when the chaplain decided that he wanted to go, the chief of chaplains in the division wanted to go with my chaplain and me in my Jeep on a place, to some place he needed to go or wanted to go. And he knew how to go. He thought he did. And as we went out of the little village where we were, I realized we were going the wrong way, and I raised the question, and the colonel assured me that he knew what he was doing, where he was going. So we went on down these roads, some of which were had been swept of mines, and came to a little crossroads, and there was a one-car path taking off to the right. That had not been mined, had not been swept for mines. But the colonel believed it was a shortcut to where he wanted to go. So we continued on that little road for a while, and rounded a curve, and all of a sudden there was a blown up vehicle beside the road, and I had to brake to stop suddenly. And when we got out of the car, got out of the Jeep and looked around, we saw that there were the heads of 4 men. They were sitting up on the stump of their necks, almost as if they had been planted in the earth. I turned around and started to go back to the Jeep, and there was another head between the front wheels of my Jeep. The roads were sometimes covered with dead animals, horses. There were cows that had been killed by the shrapnel. There were dead Germans everywhere. Most of our graves registration people were very skilled in taking our troops off the field. So I didn't see those that often. I was never in what I call the front lines, but always very close. And the division was following up, the artillery was following up the infantry batteries, and as we worked, often we would have services. The highest number of worship services we had in one day was 7, I believe. They were in all kinds of places, out in the bush, out in the open, sometimes in grand churches or cathedrals in Europe. And surprisingly enough, we had some wonderful services. I remember one of my friends was a man who had performed with the La Scala Opera Company. Magnificent voice. And I remember his singing Arioso one Sunday in church in a Lutheran building. Well, there are many memories, too many to burden whoever's watching this. But finally, the war was over. I learned a lot about making do. About staying warm, about bathing out of a helmet, about being sustained by K rations and all cold stuff. But I also remember days like Thanksgiving in the desert in Arizona when we were in training, when we stood with our mess kits on the hood of a Jeep and the wind was blowing the sand fiercely everywhere. But in spite of that, we were eating turkey and dressing and cranberry sauce and all the good stuff that you have at Thanksgiving. When the war was over, my chaplains were sent home. I was footloose for a while when my last chaplain left. One of the colonels who was in our division, head of the chaplaincy in that division, asked me if I would be willing to come and work in his office because his office staff had been sent home. And he said, I know you have expressed an interest in ministry. And he said, I can't teach you the Greek and the Hebrew that you would want to know, but he said, I can teach you a lot about the men. Well, as it happened, the chaplain that was speaking was the one that I met for whom I had no warm feelings and in fact did not really respect. And I didn't want to go to his office to work knowing that.
You say you met this chaplain before?
Oh yes. Yes, he had been over the chaplains that I worked for.
Oh, I see.
As the colonel. They were captains. But he I went to the adjutant general in our division, which I was a fella I had met, fine young officer. And and I told him flat out that I didn't want to transfer. And told him why. And he said, Jen, that's something you won't have to do. He said, to tell you the truth, I feel exactly the same way. He said, if I have to make a job till your points are up to go home, I'll do it. And he did. I was released in December of 1945. Came back to America, and Frankie met me outside of Fort Knox at Louisville. And I had what I felt was a call to the ministry. After about 6 months in the military, I began to think of church and the needs of people in a different way than I had before. And one night, we were before I went overseas, I was lying on the side of a hill in Tennessee. We were in the field, and it was a steep hill. You almost had to sleep with your feet downhill and your head up to keep from rolling off. And since it was a blackout situation, you couldn't do anything but go to bed. So I lay there in my blanket and looked up at the sky, and it was one of those magnificent nights when it seems you can see beyond the stars. And all of a sudden I just felt overwhelmed with the immensity of the universe and with the depth of the heavens and with the immensity and power and mystery of God. And my response was, how on earth could I do anything else but proclaim the glory of a God like that? After I felt the call to the ministry, it never occurred to me that I could preach without going to seminary. I had always appreciated ministers who were educated, who spoke well, and I wanted to be that kind of person. So when I got out of the military, Frank and I met in Louisville, and while we were there, we went by the seminary to talk about enrolling. And we were advised that if I intended to go the full road for a degree, that'd be better to start in the fall rather than at Christmas or after Christmas. So we agreed with that and went back to Rockmart, where we had an apartment, and I got a job in the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company mill that was located in Rockmart, sweeping cotton on the floor of the card room, because I could make more sweeping than I could by substitute teaching for school. I had teaching certificates for high school teaching Spanish or English, and I got certified in Georgia as well as Tennessee. But in the middle of the year, there wasn't much opportunity to get a job. So for about 6 to 8 months, I did that work. And after about a week of sweeping, I was given a job at a machine, to operate a machine. And I consider that a valuable part of my education. Working 8 as a rule, but occasionally 12 hours at a shift. And I was very grateful for that. The fall of 46, we moved to Louisville, where I enrolled at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and began the long trek toward a degree. It takes a minimum of 3 years to get a Master of Divinity degree. And if you go for a master's or a doctorate, it takes longer, depending on how you apply yourself. That was a great experience. I was exposed to some of the grandest professors, dedicated, powerful, wonderful men. And their impact on my life was very great. Enjoyed studying, enjoyed the Greek and the Hebrew, and the church history, biblical studies in the Old Testament and the New Testament, studies in biblical archaeology, and then practical matters about church administration and that sort of thing. But most importantly to me pastoral care. And I had the marvelous privilege of being a psychology of religion major with Dr. Wayne E. Oates, author of some 50 books on various subjects related to mental health, emotional health, and the relationship of health and religion and faith. Dr. Oates was a remarkable man, and because of that major, he recommended that if I wanted to work on a higher degree, that I take clinical pastoral education at Central State Hospital at Lakeland, Kentucky. That is a state mental hospital, and we had 12 weeks of studies, seminars, and practical experience there. My assignment was, there were 4 of us who were doing this. One of those is Dr. Julian Pentecost, who was editor of the Religious Herald in Virginia for many, many years, and a warm friend still. We had seminars about half of the day, but the other half of the day, 5 days a week, for 8 hours a day, we were part of the wards. I was assigned to a male semi-violent ward as the associate chaplain. Meanwhile, we had to do verbatim interview, talking with people, writing up verbatim interviews, turning them in for critique. And it was an exacting process, but very revealing. And I have many interesting memories related to that, which I won't go into here. Because I had had that experience and had my degree, I graduated with the Bachelor of Divinity degree in 1949. I was ordained to the ministry in 1948 at a small mission chapel of the Walnut Street Baptist Church in Louisville. And my good friend and fellow minister who was pastor at that little chapel became the professor of history at Furman University. And wrote the history of South Carolina Baptists. He was in and out of our little apartment in Louisville continuously. I was married and he was not. And he got a good meal when he came to our house. And he would often, he liked to cook, and so he would often just come with a bag of groceries and cook at our house. We had some excellent connections with older people. Namely one lady whose husband had been the professor of English at the University of Louisville. She was our landlady for a time. And a woman who after age 65 went to England to study at Stratford-on-Avon about Shakespeare. Our first child was born in Louisville, but because I had had that summer of clinical pastoral education and needed more clinical experience, Dr. Oates recommended that I become chaplain of the Jefferson County Jail. That jail was the city and county jail. And it was a political appointment. There was no stipend for a jail chaplain, but the Louisville Council of Churches had persuaded the powers that be that they needed a chaplain and that they could do without one guard and pay that salary to the chaplain. And so that's that's how I served. And I had a badge which I had to wear, hidden, but I had it at all times. And I had keys that permitted me through the jail into the cell block and that sort of thing. We had services every Sunday. It was a remarkable experience, one that you would not ever want to repeat, probably. It was a rough and tumble kind of situation, even more coarse, more profane, more criminal in nature than anything you found in the Army. But I had my office in the cell block itself, where we had approximately 400 to 500 men incarcerated at any given time. I also had responsibility for the women's section of the jail and had services for men and later for women. I've sometimes jokingly said I'm the only minister I know who had a person hang themselves while I was preaching. And that's not funny, but it happened because one Sunday there was this lady in her 40s in her cell who chose not to come to church. It was all voluntary, of course. she chose not to come to church. But when the girls who went to church came back, and these had to be brief services, they were never longer than 30 minutes. When they came back, they found her hanging in her cell by a bed sheet. And I was there before she was taken down. And, that's a sight that I don't forget. But I worked there until 1949. And at that point, I was fired. The reason I was fired, according to the sheriff who was in charge at that time, was, as he said, "You're getting so many people out of jail, I can't get enough per diem fees to operate the place." This was, of course, untrue. But he was angry because I had gone to the court as a friend of the court and facilitated the transfer of a person who was incarcerated at the jail to the general hospital because he was clearly psychotic, clearly in serious need of mental therapy. Well, that was a shaking experience. Here I am, a seminary person without employment. I had a wife and a child to support, and only 9 days' notice before being cut off. The Louisville Courier-Journal editor picked that up and wrote an editorial in the Louisville paper that was severely critical of the sheriff. And he said how ridiculous it was to fire for economic reasons the only person in the staff that was concerned about rehabilitation. Well, that helped salve the wound some, but long about that same time, there was Mr. George Stahl, who was executive and president of the Stahl Oil Refining Company in Louisville. And he came to me and said, "I know this had nothing to do with you or the quality of your ministry here." He said, "We're pleased with that." He was representing the Council of Churches. But he said, "I want to make this offer to you that if you'll write a few speeches for me," he said, "I will pay your salary." He said, "I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, I will pay that until you are called to a church or relocate." Well, that really was amazing. But the very same night that I was fired, a remarkable thing happened. Frankie was in Georgia because her father had had a heart attack. And so I went back to our apartment after getting that devastating news that I was fired, picked up the mail, And when I opened the mail, there was a letter from a friend of mine in Virginia who said, a church near me is without a pastor, and they will ask me for a recommendation because I have preached for them in revival services. And he said, would you be at all interested in coming to Virginia? I had never given it a thought. But 6 weeks later, we moved into the parsonage at Wytheville, Virginia. And we stayed there 20 years, reared our daughters there. And while we had all of the ups and downs that people have in churches, I didn't realize at the moment that it was part of my preparation for the work I would do later. And that work in the Army gave me almost immediate rapport with men. That work that I had in the cotton mill gave me quick rapport with people who worked in all kinds of manufacturing. And the work in the mental hospital was preparing me for counseling people in churches, because you have sick people in church sometimes. And the work that I did in the jail relieved me of any possibility of being shocked about anything, which is something you need as a pastor. And all of those things together, I have never lost a day's pay. I have felt God's leading in all of those changes. Frank and I have always prayed together. We still do. And we believe that God hears and answers prayer. We've been through a lot of trauma together. Frank's brother was murdered at age 25, and that's still an unsolved case. We were bereft of all of our parents. We lost a child at birth, and we lost a daughter at age 47 to breast cancer. All of those things have made us feel more deeply the hurts that other folks have. They have given us tender hearts, and they've done much to bless our lives. And if you'll come back, we'll talk about my woman and how much I love her.
All right, hello, Mimi. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
My name is Frankie Henderson Massey, and I'm very pleased that our grandson wants to take a picture of his grandparents. I was born in 1922, January 13, on a Friday, and I was born in Birmingham, Alabama. We lived there very short time, probably 2 years, and moved back to Georgia where my mother grew up. We lived in a little town called Tallapoosa, which is an Indian name, and there was a river by that name. One of the fondest memories I have of growing up was that families went to this river for picnics and just had a marvelous time. We lived there until I was 10, and we moved to a little town called Rockmart, Georgia. I have some fond memories of my mother's parents, who were named Woody. My grandfather's name was John Woody, and my grandmother was Mary Woody. Grandpa was a miller. He had a grist mill, and he ground up corn and wheat and made flour and meal. And people from the county and the countryside would bring their products in, and he would make meal and flour. Grandpa was very well respected in Haralson County. The thing I remember most about Grandpa Woody was that people said his word was his bond. And in those days you didn't have to sign a paper, you just, by word of mouth, knew whether somebody was honest and sincere. And he was very well respected, I'm told. My mother had one sister and several brothers whom I did not know. They had died early, some of them very tragically, and one was on a railroad trestle very high, and he fell from it, killed him. And another had some kind of fever, and he also died before I was born, but I've heard Mother speak of it. And she had a sister named Lou, who was almost my mother. She was good to all of us. My mother had been married before, and my father had too. Mother had 3 children, their last name was MacDonald. Mother had to me, a very sad experience in that her husband left her, deserted her when she was pregnant with my brother Harry. And nobody ever knew what happened to him. And because Mother had no husband to help support her, she had a boarding house. And my daddy was one of her boarders, and that's how they met and fell in love and married. And Daddy really adopted these 3 children. He never did have their name changed, and I wished that he had it. But he was a wonderful father to them and to me. Going back to my childhood, I remember going to first grade at school, and a highlight of that was a candy kitchen, which was right next door to the school. And oh my, those delectable candies in the candy case that were all homemade. And for a penny, you could, and a nickel, for a nickel, you could just buy lots of stuff. But anyway, I started first grade, and I remember my sister took me, and we had to go through some woods to get to the school, and we went by my grandparents' house. And we always stopped at the house because Grandma always had some cookies or something that we could eat as we went through the woods to the school. One of the things I remember about first grade was that the teachers had me go up to third grade and letter some posters and teach the third graders how to do that when I was in first grade. And then we moved to Rockmart. I didn't say that Daddy had various jobs. There were a lot of things that he could do. He was a painter, decorating houses of very wealthy people inside and decorating their furniture. And he was a self-taught artist, and a rather good one. Among the jobs he had before we moved to Rockmart was in this little town of Tallapoosa, and he was chief of police. There was some time that I don't remember real well when he was trying to catch, I'll call him an outlaw for lack of a better word, somebody who was notorious. And there was a car race actually through town when Daddy was trying to arrest him. And the man shot Daddy. And I remember very little about it except that he was in a hospital in Atlanta for weeks and weeks and nearly died. But he recovered from that. And later, when I was preschool, I don't know how old, he was getting ready to go to work as a policeman, and he accidentally shot himself in the side. And I was standing back of him, and my mother says that the bullet just barely missed me, and it landed in a chair back of me, and we had that chair till I was grown, and you could see where the bullet went through. And Daddy was in the hospital again in Atlanta for that, but he recovered. We didn't have a lot of money, but I didn't know we were poor at the time. Grandpa Woody was considered rather well off until the Great Depression, and he lost all of his money in a bank there. I remember Mother telling me about when she was a teenager that Grandpa bought her a wagon, sort of a surrey with a fringe on top, and a beautiful horse. And I remember that she said that he paid $100 for the horse, which in those days was a lot of money. But evidently Mother was very pretty. And in fact, I have a picture of her that I think is very pretty. But she married young, very young. And this man she married was named MacDonald. And he came from a very prominent family in that little town. But anyway, as I said, he disappeared and left mother with 2 children and 1 on the way. So you can imagine how my grandparents felt about him and his family. But anyway, as I said earlier, Daddy adopted all 3 of the children, and they had a very happy marriage for the most part. I remember Daddy never left the house to go to work or anywhere before he kissed Mother and called her sweetheart. And until very late in life, he showed great affection for Mother. He became ill and some things changed, but anyway, he was very good to my half-sister and half-brothers, and as if they were his own children, and they called him Daddy and loved him also. Daddy worked in a textile mill in Tallapoosa after he had this stint as chief of police, and that was a life that, unless you had grown up and lived it, people here in Virginia, I think, don't have any idea what it was like. They employed people, in fact, employed my brother Harry when he was about 12 years old, and he worked in the factory. I guess sweeping, I don't know what he did, and just made practically nothing. But that mill closed, and Goodyear Mill opened in Rockmart, Georgia. And this was, at that time, a most unusual situation. The mill was a beautiful brick building, and new in let's see, I was 10 years old, so that would have been 1932. And Daddy got a job there as an overseer. And this Goodyear company had built a village where the employees could live, and the houses were really well made. And they had, I think I said they had 2,000 employees. All of them couldn't live in the village because they didn't build that many houses, but most of them did. And those houses are still there, and people still live in them. And some of the roofs that were made on those houses way back then are still working. They had what they called Boss's Road, which were houses that were made of brick. And Daddy was a boss, so we got to live in one of the brick houses. In fact, we lived in several of them because people had a custom of when one family would move out, if that were a better house, you could ask to have that house and move in it. So we did 3 or 4 houses on that same street. They were very well made, and the mill had people to do all the painting if the houses needed to be painted, or any painting or any work of any kind. They had workmen to do it. They took care of all the lawns and the shrubbery, kept it neatly trimmed, and it was just an unusual situation. I went to grammar school there in the 4th grade. When we lived in Tallapoosa, I was supposed to skip a grade and not have to go to 4th grade. But when we went to a different town, I did go in 4th grade, didn't skip a grade. I remember the first year we were there, I was the new girl in the class, and I got more Valentines than anybody else. I just had worlds and worlds of Valentines. I had a teacher named Miss Bird, and she was a wonderful teacher. And I kind of got to be teacher's pet, I guess, because she was so good to me. I finished that little grade school and went to what we called junior high then, which was in a different building. I made excellent grades, which sounds like I'm bragging, but I did. and I'm gonna brag some more. But the teachers always complimented my handwriting and my papers and my work. Believe it or not. Now people in another generation might not believe that, but it happened anyway. I loved school and had just wonderful teachers. When I went to high school, I also had wonderful teachers, and that was my first experience of having several teachers, as schools do now. I was very fortunate to have a church that became a very wonderful part of my life. A pastor and his wife came there from Spokane, Washington. They had been students at Carson-Newman College and were instrumental in my being able to go to Carson-Newman as a student. I was the only one in my family who had ever been to college at all, and money was hard to come by. And Mother and Daddy wondered, this minister I had insisted that I go, and he would help me, and Mother and Daddy wondered how they would ever pay for my going, but I got a work grant, and Mother and Daddy somehow paid for my going there. I didn't go but 2 years. I had planned to graduate, but as I'll tell you later, the war came along, and I went to work in the plant where Daddy worked.
Didn't you sing with some people in high school?
Yes, this preacher's wife was a wonderful musician, and she picked 6 of us girls who were in YWA, which is Young Women's Association, a mission group of young women, to sing at a special program we had. And that turned, there were 6 of us. It was a double trio or a sextet, we called it. And we were invited to sing in so many places. Ms. Gears was the lady's name, and she was a wonderful musician. We sang a cappella, and we, at that time, Baptist denomination didn't have a retreat or anything like that, but every summer they had conferences at the colleges, Baptist colleges throughout the state. One was Shorter, one was Mercer. There were Bessie Tift. I can't remember all of them, but every summer we would spend the summers for, I don't remember whether it was 2 years or 3 years, going to these conferences all summer long. And also we were invited to sing on WSB, which was the radio station in those days in Atlanta. And Dr. Louis Newton, who's a very famous preacher, was pastor of Druid Hills Baptist Church in Atlanta. And he had us to sing on this radio station and made a record of it there. And we had wonderful opportunities to sing. I guess the highlight of it was the Baptist World Alliance met in Atlanta, and we were asked to sing there, and we did. There were 30,000 people supposedly at that meeting, and in those days that was a lot of folks to come together. They came from all over the world to attend that Baptist World Alliance. In high school, I did have a lot of honors, I guess, and I always feel like I'm bragging when I say that. Again, my teachers were just wonderful and helpful to me. There was a lady, Miss Tripp especially, who was the English teacher and the foreign language teacher. And also there were 3 men who were young men, very wonderful teachers, 2 of whom went to our church, our little Baptist church there in Rockmart. But Miss Tripp, I guess sort of took me under her wing, and she wanted me to major in journalism. And we had a little newspaper of which I was the associate editor. I was president of the student council, which was the first one they had. And I was also president of the Beta Club, which was the first one they had. And I was vice president of the senior class. There were 2 other girls who were in my class, and the 3 of us made practically the same grades, particularly in English and French. And Miss Tripp put the 3 of us in the 2nd year French class to begin with. And she was encouraging to me in so many ways, and wanted me to go to college, University of Georgia mainly, but while we had a contest in the school every year. The most outstanding student was, woman was, or girl, I was then, wasn't I? To be Miss Rockmart High School, and it wasn't for beauty. It was supposed to be all round and most likely to succeed. And I received that honor for the girls. And this was, I had my picture on the front page of the little newspaper and all that. And Miss Tripp got a lot of the little high school newspapers together, and she was going to send them to the University of Georgia and help me get a scholarship. Meantime, our school burned, and all of that material burned too. Everybody loved that old school, and we were, of course, heartbroken it burned, but we had to have the graduation in the little theater there. And that year, rather than have valedictorian and salutatorian, we had an honor group, and there were 13 of us, and our class wasn't very big, 20-some, so just half of the class was in it. But anyway, these other 2 girls and I had just about the same grades. And we sort of all shared the same honor of, as graduates. As I said, we had the graduation in the high school. I also received a book, and I can't remember the name of it now. It didn't get there in time for the graduation. It was supposed to be presented to me by the principal, and he called me to his office, temporary office, after the graduation and gave it to me, and I can't remember the name of it now, but it was an encouraging book anyway. Mr. Gears, the pastor of the church, was intent on my going to Carson Newman, where he went. And he was a protege of Dr. C. Oscar Johnson, who was president of the Baptist World Alliance. And how Mr. Gears, who grew up in Washington State, knew Dr. Johnson, who lived in the middle America, I don't know. But anyway, he and his wife were wonderful in helping me go to college. It was quite an event for my family, and especially for my mother and daddy. And Mother went with me on the train up to Tennessee, and we took a great big trunk, I remember, and that belonged to the preacher too. It was a wardrobe trunk, metal, and when I got to a room at Carson Newman, you just opened it up and you had drawer space and hanging space, and that's about all we had for a place to put clothes, because we had 3 girls in a room. But anyway, Mother, as I said, went with me on the train, and she talked to a Dr. Cook, who happened to be the brother of a lady in our church in Rockmart, who helped me in getting this job, working for the art teacher, which I loved. The art teacher was very wonderful to me. She had studied in Paris, and also at a very famous artist school in New York. And she wanted me to go to New York to study. Well, of course, that was out of the question, but anyway, I appreciated her thinking I might go. Soon after we got to Carson Newman, very soon, as I said, we went up on the train, and there was a little station where so many students arrived, and the luggage had to be carried up to the college, which was up a hill. And one of the first people I met was a young man who helped with all the suitcases, mine and some of the other girls. My roommate was a girl from Rockmart who lived on the same street I did, and her father and my father had the same jobs. And she had great big brown eyes, and all the fellas succumbed over those brown eyes. Well, I thought this young man who was helping with the luggage was going to fall for him too. But anyway, I liked him first time I saw him. And we got settled in the dorm, and the dining room was there, and he was a host for one of the tables where we sat. And we got acquainted, and the more I saw him, the more I liked him. But I still thought he was going to fall for Helen's brown eyes. But anyway, we became better acquainted, and we had Carson Newman never had dances in our day and time, but they had formal dinners. And this young man invited me to go with him to the formal dinner, which I could hardly believe. Meantime, we had big sisters, older classmen who adopted the freshmen. And this girl named Dorothy sort of adopted me and asked me to spend the night in her dorm one night before the formal dinner. And when we were talking after the lights were out, she said, "Frankie, do you have an SP?" I said, "Well, I don't know. I do not. What is it?" And she said, "It's a secret passion." And I said, "Well, I don't know." And she said, "Well, I do. And his name is James Massey." And she said something about the formal dinner and hoping maybe he would invite her to go. And I said, "Well, Dorothy, I'm afraid not, because he's already asked me." So that was the end of our friendship. No, it really wasn't the end of our friendship. But anyway, we went to the formal dinner, and I've told James this, and he didn't believe me, but I really fell in love with him. I think first time I saw him. And I thought, now he'll never, ever love me. But I think I'll always love him, no matter if it never goes any further. And he insists that he doesn't believe that I felt that way, but I did. But anyway, he asked me to more formal dinners, and we became good friends, and were prayer partners at college, and we are till this day. Every morning here in this room we read the Bible and have devotional, and we've been married now almost 65 years. Our marriage has been so wonderful, and it's just hard to believe how happy we've been, and what a wonderful husband he is, and what a wonderful father and grandfather in person he is. James had to go into service on his graduation day. He got orders to go into the military. And on the 4th of July, 1942, he was called up in service at Fort Benning, Georgia. We had planned I had finished 2 years at Carson Newman, and because the war came along, women were employed in all kinds of work. I didn't know how Mother and Daddy could afford to send me 2 more years to college, but I was going to work and try to save the money and go. But they needed workers, so I went to work in the mill, in the office, keeping a record of everybody's work hours. Everybody worked 8 hours a day, and there were, as I said earlier, about 2,000 employees. And I sat there all day and made 8s, because if they worked that day.
You made 8s?
8, like 8 hours.
Oh.
And I had great big charts, with everybody's name on it, and I would go from one department to another, recording their work hours. And Daddy kept working in the mill. He worked at night as what they called a second hand or an overseer. But anyway, James had to go into the Army, as I said, and he had asked, well, I didn't say about his asking me to marry him. That's very important. This happened at Carson Newman too. We were sitting out under a tree in front of the Ed building one Sunday afternoon, and he asked me if I'd like to spend my life with him. Of course, yes came right quick. And we had planned to wait 5 years, I guess, to be married because of the war and because of my hopefully finishing college. I had had some wonderful times at Carson Newman. I was elected vice president of the freshman class, which surprised me to death. And we had a literary society called High Patience. And a freshman was chosen to present a play of some kind right at the beginning of school, and they asked me to do it. And I remember that I did, and I, for lack of a better plan, I guess, I had the woman who lived in the shoe and made an enormous shoe out of cardboard and painted it and all that, like the house that the story has. And we had several of the girls who were members to dress up like the children, and I don't remember much about the skit, but anyway, we did it. And I was also a freshman debater, and I remember I was scared to death. I did pretty well until the rebuttal time came, and I just froze. And I don't remember what I said. If I didn't say much because I was too traumatized by that. I was just really scared. But anyway, Carson Newman was wonderful. There too, we made a lot of friends, and the professors were wonderful. But getting back to James going into service, he was in Tennessee, and I was working there in the mill. And one night in November, a friend of mine was spending the night with me at my mother's house. And a neighbor came and knocked on the door and said, somebody wants to talk to Frankie on the phone. My mother didn't have a phone in those days. Just one or two people on our street had a telephone, and this house was 2 doors down, and it was 11 o'clock at night, and everybody had already gone to bed. But this lady came and knocked on the door and told me that somebody wanted to speak to me on the phone. So I put on a robe, I guess, and went down the street to her house, and it was James. And he asked me if we wanted to get married Sunday, and this was Wednesday night. And of course I said yes. My poor mother must have just about pulled her hair out with a wedding coming up on Sunday. And this was Wednesday night, and the next day was Thanksgiving Day, which was a holiday. But anyway, James had gotten a leave, a week's leave, I believe it was, which was unexpected, and he really went AWOL to go to find a telephone to call me. And the next day, as I said, was Thanksgiving Day. In those days, people in Georgia raised hogs, or had other people raise them, and they killed them, and they cut up the meat and they saved it, and that furnished a lot of food for them for a while. And it happened that Mother and Daddy had bought half a hog, and it was being killed on Thanksgiving Day, which added to Mother's responsibilities of getting a wedding ready for Sunday. But my sister Mildred and my sister-in-law, who lived in Rome, Georgia, came to my rescue and came and got the house ready for lunch on Sunday. We had planned to be married on Sunday after church at our little First Baptist Church in Rockmart. Meantime, I had to go talk to the preacher, and James and I had thought we would be married in the parsonage, but they were insistent that it was their idea that we have it at church after the worship service, which is what we did. Our little church had a new organ, and this was the first time a wedding march had been played on the organ. We had white football mums to decorate the church. In order to get off from work, I had to work on Thanksgiving Day, even though the plant was closed. And the next day, I had to find something to wear in the wedding. And went to a little town called Cedartown, which was a county seat, and they had a few good stores. And I picked out a blue dress and a dress that was toast colored. We had a special feeling for the color blue when one morning at Carson Newman, when James wasn't sure that I was the one, he told me that he prayed that I would wear blue if I were going to be the one. Would wear blue into chapel, and that there were times when the seniors could have classmates sit beside them in their special place. And I came in and sat beside him, and it happened that I had worn blue, and even a blue ribbon in my hair. And he told me later that he had prayed that I would wear, if I were the one, I would wear blue that day. And I had done that. We had wonderful times there in college. But getting back to the wedding, Dr. and Mrs. Knight were pastor and his wife of the church at that time, and just, oh my, it meant so much to us. And they insisted that we have the wedding rather than in their house, in their parsonage, in the church sanctuary after worship on Sunday morning. And that's what we did. My sister Mildred was made a matron of honor, and his brother was best man. His mother and an aunt and a cousin, no, let's see, his brother and his girlfriend, I think, came down from Nashville to Rockmart. We had a time getting a place for them to stay, because in those days you didn't have motels or hotels in little towns like that. But some of them stayed at my brother's and some at the pastor's home. And, anyway, plans went on to have the wedding after the worship service. And when the worship service was over, the pastor said, "There's going to be a wedding here this morning, and anybody who wants to stay is welcome to do so." Well, nobody left. And we were married on November 29th, 1942, in that little church. We had a lunch, as I said, that my sister and sister-in-law prepared at Mother's house. And that afternoon, we went on the train to Chattanooga, Tennessee, for our honeymoon. We didn't have a reservation. It happened that the hotel where we stayed catered to a lot of servicemen, and they had all gone back to camp, I guess. So we were lucky to get a room at the Patton Hotel. And we stayed there for 2 or 3 days and nights, and then went on to Nashville, where James' parents lived. And we were there for the rest of his leave from the Army. And then he went back to camp, and I went back to Rockmart and back to work. He was in service 3.5 years, and overseas 18 months. And of course we didn't see each other, even when he was still in the States, very much, but there were times when we could meet in Chattanooga. One time when he thought he was going overseas, I met him in New Jersey, and we were there about a week in Trenton, New Jersey. And during that time, we went up to New York City and saw some plays or movies at Radio City Music Hall. And then he had to go back to camp, and I had to come back home. And I went back to work, and about a week after that, I went home for lunch. And believe it or not, James was sitting in our little living room. And my boss thought, I think, that I made up the story about his going overseas when I went to New Jersey. But it happened that he had gotten a leave, and so we had a few more days together in our little apartment in Rockmart. The little apartment was, we thought, a wonderful place. It was all of 2 rooms and a bath and a little back porch. And we furnished it with odds and ends, and used a lot of color so that we loved it, and other people seemed to do so also. In those days you couldn't buy a stove, but somehow James managed to find a kerosene stove. And then later he somehow found a used electric stove. So we really were fortunate to have an electric stove. Some of the furniture that we used belonged to other people that we borrowed, furniture we borrowed. Some of it we made out of secondhand stuff. And I remember that we had a dresser that was painted white, had good lines, but it was secondhand. We may have paid $10 for it. And my daddy cried that we had to use secondhand furniture. And now, I'd give anything to have that dresser back. But we had a lovely little apartment. And James got to come home a few times before he had to go overseas. And as I said, he was overseas at least a year and a half in the European theater.
Would you say that's the longest time that you two have been away?
Mm-hmm. And I hope so. Hope that we won't ever have to do that again. But he came back after the war was over. And by the way, I have a drawer full of letters upstairs that I have kept that he wrote to me. Not only from overseas, but when he was in the States too. And I think when we moved from Louisville, where James went to seminary, I think we maybe burned some of them, and I wish I still had them. But anyway, I've got a drawer full still.
Well, we're back. We had a short break as the battery died on us. But we're back to finish Mimi's life. So just continue where you left off.
I believe we talked about thinking you were supposed to go overseas, but had a little leeway and got to come home even. And then we had about a week together, and then James had to go overseas to the European theater. He left from Austin, I believe, on D-Day, didn't he? And was on the ocean, traveling to Europe while D-Day was happening, I think. And he had worked with a chaplain, different chaplains in service, as an assistant chaplain. This turned out to be good in a lot of ways. He had quite a lot of experiences that he could tell us that I don't know about. But anyway, I remember his telling about driving through the night without lights in well, what's his name? Patton's army, and he can tell us more about that later. While he was in, I have a brother, younger brother, Paul, who also was in the army. He married very young and did enlist or was drafted, I don't remember which, in the army, and went to Europe. And it so happened that James was driving a big, I don't know whether a truck or a Jeep, and Paul also was driving an army vehicle. And somewhere in Europe, and James probably can tell you where, they met at a crossroads. Of all things, to see each other just by happenstance, and just for very few minutes to say hello and goodbye. But that was most unusual. Paul stayed in the European theater until the war was over, and then he went to the Pacific theater and was in Korea. He had his feet frozen there and was sent home. Meantime, my father had a heart attack, and well, I believe Paul got to come home not only because of his feet being frozen, but because of Daddy's illness. He got to come home and see Daddy because they thought Daddy was dying. Daddy did die at age 59 of a heart problem. This is getting ahead of us somewhat because it happened after we, in 1952, went to Withville, Virginia to live. James has been at seminary in Louisville and finished seminary and needed a church, and he could tell what happened all during this time, a series of events that we never dreamed would happen, but the Lord took care of us through it all. But anyway, he was asked to come to Southwest Virginia to preach at a church in Marion, Virginia, because a church in Withville, Virginia needed a pastor. They were about 25, 30 miles apart. And the pastor there was a former classmate at Carson Newman, Primitivo Delgado. He was a Cuban and good friend, and he asked James if he'd be interested in becoming pastor of that church, and arranged for the committee at the Withville Church to come to the church in Marion to hear James preach. James' sister lived in Bristol, Virginia, or Tennessee. It's right on the state line. And our daughter Joy was very small then, almost 2, and we stayed in Bristol with James' sister while he preached, or yes, he did preach in Marion with this committee. Meantime, in the afternoon, people in my family and in Rockmart had been trying to get in touch with me and didn't know where I was because they thought we were still in Louisville. And it happened that this was Mother's Day, and my brother, who had served on both theaters of the war, had been discharged and had come home and was back in civilian life with his family. But he had been missing for 2 weeks, and on that day, Mother's Day, his body was found by some fishermen who were fishing in one of the rivers in Rome, Georgia, and found his body in the river. He had been, his body had been dragged into the river. He did not drown, but had been killed, murdered. We never knew when nor who did it, but there was suspicion of the people who did it, who were never convicted of anything. And we were told that he had a blow to the head. But anyway, this news was given to my mother and daddy on Mother's Day at their front door. And it was just impossible to believe. But anyway, they finally got in touch with us, and we went down to Georgia. Meantime, Daddy had this heart condition, and he died. My father died 6 months to the day after Paul's body was discovered. And although he had a heart problem, the doctors said he died of heartbreak rather than heart trouble, because he was so brokenhearted over Paul's death. Mother lived alone for 11 years after Daddy died. she was quite a person. Mother didn't have a lot of education, and neither did my father. In fact, Daddy just went to the 3rd grade. But I wish you could have seen his handwriting. It was absolutely beautiful. And the books that he kept for the employees at the mill were just absolutely perfect. And I wish I had kept them, the time books. And even though he had just 3rd grade education, he was very smart. He read a lot, and he knew what was going on in the world.
Knew math.
Mm-hmm.
He knew math.
Yes, he knew math. The mill had a plan where Georgia Tech boys, students came for 3 months out of a year and worked in the mill. And Daddy supervised several of them at a time every summer, or I don't know whether it's summer or winter, sometime during the school year anyway. But they came and worked in the mill. And Daddy could work circles around them in math. They would ask him how to do some of the problems, and he knew how. He was self-taught. Mother didn't, I don't know how far she went in school. She didn't graduate from high school. I'm told that she played an old pump organ in the little church, little white wooden church in Tallapoosa, Georgia, when she was young. I never heard her play, but anyway, they said that she played in church. Mother was an introvert, I guess. She was never very active in the church in Rockmart. She had a problem of being in crowds, and it upset her terribly. And I've stood beside her in our church in Withville and felt her shake, because it would be so traumatic for her. Let's see now, where was I? I told you about Paul.
Mm-hmm.
He had a little child, a little boy. His wife was very young, of course. And after Paul was killed, well, Mother and Daddy didn't approve of the marriage in the first place. But anyway, after Paul was killed, Paul's wife's family would not let my mother and daddy see his little boy, which broke their hearts. He was a little redhead too. He still lives in Rockmart, and he's married to a school teacher. He doesn't stay in touch with us at all. I wish he would, but his wife did write a Christmas card, tell us about their family. Let's see, where did I go from there? Well, James came home from, the war was over, and James came home. And we met in Louisville, Kentucky. He was discharged at Fort Knox, Kentucky. And I went up on the train again. We rode the trains a lot in those days to Louisville to meet him. And I bought him a new suit at a men's store in Rome that had really good clothes. And I paid $50 for his suit. In those days, that was a lot of money. But it was a beautiful gray suit. And I took it to Louisville, and the pants were hemmed, and it was ready for him to put on. And he did, and we went out to eat at one of the nice restaurants in Louisville. And that was the prettiest suit I think he's ever had. And while we were there, we went out to Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which was in Louisville, in view of James going there as a student. Meantime, he had had an experience while he was in the Army, and I'm not sure whether he told you about that, where he felt the Lord was really calling him to preach. And so we met with Dean at Louisville Seminary in view of his becoming a student there, which he did in the fall. We went back to Rockmart, to our little apartment, and the dean had told James it'd be better to enter the seminary later rather than in January. So he worked in the mill, got a job in the mill, and worked till the fall. He could make more sweeping the floors there than he could teaching school. He had a teacher's certificate to teach Spanish and English. They paid $80 a month, if you can believe that, to a teacher. And he could make, I don't remember what, in the mill, but more than that. So he got a job for the summer. Meanwhile, I forgot to mention, I think, that while I was a student at Carson Newman for 2 summers, I worked out in the plant as a worker, and I did what they call picking rollers. And it was a cotton mill, and all these great big machines were making clackety-clack noises, and there was cotton everywhere. They made thread for the inside of tires, Goodyear tires. But anyway, this job I had involved a pick where I picked off the threads from the machine that was going lickety-split, and boy, my fingers got all bruised and cut and everything until I got used to it. And I did that 2 summers, and that was quite an experience. But my family, my brothers, I had 3 brothers who all worked in the mill, and of course Daddy did. And that was a good way for me to make money to help with expenses at college.